Hey there, my name is Raphael, founder and CEO of Zendog Labs. Today we're going through common mistakes that I found or have collected based on 150 plus pitch deck reviews in the last 6 months. I am a former investor, so I've seen obviously and invested and deployed capital, started startups, so I've raised capital and worked with dozens of startups over the last 12 months looking to raise capital as an advisor. And I've also been the VC in residence at an investor matchmaking platform called Fundin that's been very popular in the startup space recently. So this is based on quite a bit of volume in terms of pitch decks that I've reviewed. Now let's dive right into it. There were essentially 4 categories of mistakes based on me trying to categorize them. And the first one is pitch deck hygiene. I think this is a big one. First of all, most decks that I look at have poor organization. I'll be recording a separate video on what I think the perfect pitch deck includes, which is mostly focused on the flow of the deck, which is one of the most important inputs into how well your narrative gets across, the key points of your deck gets across, and how engaging the pitch deck is. So the organization, if, for instance, what I see is people starting with a one-page summary, then jumping to their product, then jumping to their team, then jumping to their funding ask, going back to their product, going to market size, going to competition. That stuff doesn't work. Have not more than 15 slides and be targeted in what you say and when. And do check out that separate video that I'll be uploading soon. Second mistake, design and grammar issues. I mean, this should be an obvious one. I know, I totally understand why it happens, right? I've built pitch decks. I've looked at them for hours, in fact, probably days and weeks. And at some point, you just get blind. So do get someone external to, or even if not external, someone else to look at your deck and make sure that there are no obvious issues in there that you're just getting that you just get blind to. Third one is that there are too many slides in decks with too much text. Limit yourself to at most 15 slides. Definitely, this is not your pitch deck. This is not your business plan. So definitely don't go 45, 60 slides. Stay with 15. Much of that can be moved to the appendix if you think it could be relevant for an investor discussion. And then as you send your deck to an investor to request an introduction, never send your appendix as part of the core deck, because the moment I open a slide deck and it has 45 slides, I'm going to make a very serious decision whether, first of all, I believe that you have an appendix, so I may flip through to that and then be relieved if you have one. And if I don't make that or get confused because it's not clear where your appendix starts, I have to decide whether I want to spend half an hour reviewing your deck, and in 9 out of 10 cases, the answer is going to be no, and your deck goes right to the recycling bin. Me making that conclusion ties back to me expecting from founders that they're good at fundraising. Why does that matter? Well, I have a couple of blog posts on my website talking about this too, and I may record a video on it in the future, but I do expect you as founders to be good at fundraising because it's a core capability for you. You, after raising capital from me or someone else at the current round, will have to go on to raise more and more capital in future rounds until you ultimately exit, which means the success of me as an investor is dependent on your fundraising capabilities, which means if I see that you don't have them, I have to make a decision on whether I want to give you the runway to get educated about it, maybe help you educate or learn about it, or just pass. And then, in most cases, I will pass because I don't have the time to do the first two things. Descriptive instead of action titles is another classic one where people will say stuff like competition, market size, products, funding ask, which is helpful from a navigational perspective, but doesn't really tell me anything about the contents of your deck and the narrative of your startup, the thesis of your startup. So what I suggest, instead of descriptive titles at the top of your slides, use action titles, which could be something like laser focused go-to-market strategy with unicorn business case, or uniquely positioned in market with peers that demonstrate the upside potential. These are action titles. They tell me something about your business. And then the descriptive stuff you can put into your footer, essentially the way I have it here. And for instance, down here, you could say competition. So you have that navigational aspect too, which can help orient myself, which can help readers orient themselves when they're deep in your deck and kind of get lost. But use those action titles, and the goal is that I can, as an investor, open your deck, see that you have 15 slides, all of them are with action titles, and I just need to read your action titles, and I get the key message, get excited about your business, and then spend the remaining 5 to 10 minutes I need to get to a decision whether I want to meet you. That is really the purpose of the action titles. Next one is excessive use of abbreviations. I like, especially for generalist investors, and if you're targeting generalist investors, don't expect them to be specialists in your specific niche. and know all the abbreviations, industry jargon, or whatever you may be using. Even if you think it's commonly known, don't use it. Always spell out stuff. Don't do the mistake of spelling it out once and then using abbreviations later. I definitely don't want to be flipping forth and back between your deck because I forgot what the abbreviation was about. It happens all the time. I'm a human being. So do avoid any kind of abbreviations and industry jargon. And pitch deck hygiene overall just ties back to one thing that you have to see. Most investors are former bankers or strategy consultants. In these two roles, the number one skill that you probably learn is communication and pitch deck design. So if you make sure that your deck is designed well, then you are speaking the language of the investors that you're targeting, means you're creating connection in some sense, means you're going the extra mile of putting things their way, makes it easier for them to sympathize with you and take a call. So this is actually pretty important, and it's done wrong all the time. Second category is on missing information, classic too. This is excellent. No funding ask. I've seen so many decks without an ask. You're in a sales process here, maybe not to a lead, but to an investor. So if you don't ask, you don't get. You have to have it in there. Minimally, it helps me as an investor figure out whether we are a fit and then self-qualify into having a discussion with you or not. If you're asking for too little or too much money, then maybe I already know that we're not going to be a fit because I only invest in certain categories and I cannot bend my investment rules and principles. I have agreements with my limited partners in terms of what my thesis is. I may have some flexibility and wiggle room left and right, but on average, I'm not going to do it for you. So if you are clearly out of my spec, then why not make that clear up front and save everyone's time? It's just going to be so much better. Next one, product poorly explained. I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to review a deck for, let's say, 5 to 15 minutes and then not understand what you're doing. I don't get that. If you cannot get across what you're doing in 5 to 10 minutes in a pitch deck to me, how are you going to pitch a lead that you're trying to sell to or a consumer that you're trying to win just by marketing without having a salesperson touch them? It's going to be impossible for you, and so you're not going to succeed as a business. If you cannot explain your product, or if you don't have a product that can be explained easily and quickly, then you have a problem, and I don't want to be part of that problem. Next one, how big can this get? I, as an investor, when I review your deck, I need to get reinforced in my belief that your startup is the one thing that I want to have in my portfolio because it's going to return the entire fund multiple times over and get me where I need to be as an investor. So answer that question. The best way I think you can answer it is via a case study, potentially on your business model slide, where you talk about how big this can get. You say, hey, if we had 10,000 customers or if we had 100,000 consumers on our platform, we would be in the hundreds of millions of revenue, meaning we would be a unicorn or a decathlon. Now, the alternative of the case study is that you have a revenue projection, but I think revenue projections are trash because most of the times the assumptions are poorly validated. If there is a proper revenue model in your financial model, in some cases it could be just a function of two variables that you're plugging into and making assumptions about, and then you're just going to undermine your reputation and your business acumen. And these two things are pretty important. So I don't like revenue projections, and we will talk about that in a little bit too. And I think how big can this get as a case study is much, much more impactful. Last mistake on missing information is that the deck is not geared for investors. The product description slides can certainly be the slides that you use to talk to customers. Although even on your solution overview slide, for instance, there are things that you would change when you pitch to an investor versus a customer. But these are slides where it's kind of more natural to talk as you would talk to a customer. But on all other slides, you don't. You don't have a funding ask, you don't have a market size, you certainly don't have a competition slide. Well, in some pitch decks, in some sales decks, you may have a competition slide, but on average, you don't have it. So make sure it's geared for investors and do spend the time necessary to build a proper pitch deck and get the help that you need in order to make sure it's good enough, because pitch decks are the one controllable that you have, or the one variable that you have under control as you fundraise, right? Your individual investor preferences, market conditions, the competition that you're facing, how far you are as a business are all things you can only marginally or minimally change, and it will usually take you some time. The pitch deck is pretty easy to fix, so make sure it's good. All right. The last two categories, first one is business judgment and the second one is funding ask, or more on funding ask. Let's start with business judgment. The first one I see almost always, I spoke to it a little bit earlier when I spoke about revenue projections, is unvalidated assumptions. If I go into your market sizing, for instance, and want to have a discussion about how did you get to this absurd number of market size, and you tell me I took a Statista report, or you tell me I multiplied A times B and it's really it, and I have no idea where these figures come from, or even worse, I used my internal pricing, it's going to not look good. So validate assumptions, use external assumptions whenever possible. Second one, this is a little frustrating too, though I think it can be forgiven, is the competitive review, where you have, I think most startups do this, right? You have yourself and 3 to 5 competitors on a slide, and you pick 5 to 7 features that you compare yourself, or maybe 3 to 5, and you happen to be the best at all of them. And that is usually not true just by you being a startup, and you likely comparing yourself against enterprise businesses, and so it's just completely unrealistic that you are actually better than them. So it's almost like a future perspective on what your competitive positioning will be, and that's fine. But even then, be honest. The goal is not the goal of the competitive overview is not to show that you're the only viable business in this market. As a matter of fact, you want to show that competitors are successful because it indicates that there is a viable and healthy market that you're going into. If there are no competitors, for instance, which is the second interpretation of what I'm writing here, that you're assuming that there are no competitors, that's a very negative sign, at least in my perspective. All right, point number 3, top-down market sizing. The best way to do market sizing is really just to go bottom up, which is usually a function of, hey, I'm making certain assumptions around demand, for instance. Let's say we are trying to calculate the size of the auto car market, right? How many households are they? How many cars per household do you have? And then what's the replacement rates of cars? And then you sum up these assumptions that you ideally, again, validated externally, and you're not using your own internal assumptions and pricing to get to a bottom-up market size. That's your total addressable market, and then from there you can take it down to the serviceable and then the obtainable market, which are called SAM and SOM. And so you have the TAM, SAM, and SOM. You take those, you take the CAGR of the market, which is the growth rate over the next 3 to 5, maybe 10 years, and that's really all that you need for your market sizing slide. So avoid top-down. Top-down is actually a pretty big one, right? There are businesses that go bankrupt because they've relied on a wrong top-down market sizing. I don't want to say slide, but just wrong top-down market sizing. The number one root cause for there being too many products, services, and startups in certain markets is probably Statista, because they come up with BS market sizes all the time. Don't rely on Statista. You have no control over what they use as assumptions. Next one, unrealistic revenue projections. Spoke about it earlier. I hate seeing 50 to 250, maybe even 500 million in annual revenue in 3 to 5 years from now in your business plan, and every startup does it. I don't know where this is coming from, but everyone can plug these numbers on a slide and have filled that slide up, and then it's getting torn apart in 5 minutes by a professional investor because you didn't validate your assumptions, and it's just unrealistic what you're assuming. And so instead, use that case study I spoke about earlier. It's the how big this can get case study. Make basic assumptions about how many customers, or scenarios about how many customers, or what would happen if you had XYZ number of customers given your pricing model. And then it's up to everyone else that are reading your deck, the investors, to get excited themselves rather than you having to show them unrealistic revenue projections. Last one is on business judgment, is anything relating services, agency, customization, language that would indicate that you are not scalable, that you're very hands-on. It's perfectly fine for a startup to start with manual work initially. Many times, especially in the enterprise SaaS space, you will need to do pretty heavy consulting to get into accounts because they don't trust you otherwise, and that's okay. Always try to avoid that type of language in your pitch deck. You don't want to be disguising information. You can call it onboarding, and onboarding is perfectly fine even for tech startups. Just don't talk about you being a consulting firm or a services business or an agency, because those don't scale well. You need more humans or more people for more revenue, and that is not a healthy equation. As investors are looking for it, you can build extremely successful businesses doing this. Don't get me wrong. I mean, McKinsey, Boston Consulting, and the auditing firms are all relying on this model and are large. Last category is on funding ask, and then we're going to wrap up this video. The first one here is funding asked too high for traction. This should be an obvious one. If you're asking for 10 million in funding and you have 0 in revenue, maybe not even a product, then you're just not going to succeed. That's impossible to do. I mean, if you are a previously exited founder, and we're talking about a large and successful exit, and you're putting a lot of your own capital into the business to show that you have skin in the game, then maybe. But first-time founders, forget about it. Even in the US, I would say it's impossible. And serial entrepreneurs, you'll also have a hard time. So be realistic and budget carefully for, let's say, 18 to a maximum of 24 months of runway, and ask that. Next one is on dangerously high valuation. I'm recording this video in 2023 where we're having high interest rates and high inflation, and we're seeing, especially in later rounds, we're seeing down rounds and a pressure on valuation that we didn't see before. And so if you raised at inflated valuations in the past, you will have to grow into those valuations. And that's just becoming harder as market conditions may change, they change all the time. And if you happen to raise once and run out of runway, if and when they deteriorated, then you're going to be in a tight spot. You will have to accept a down road that's going to dilute you, and your former investors is going to make your board very unhappy, and maybe even most likely even take control out of your own hands over the business. And you may get replaced as a CEO. I mean, you deserve it at this point. So asking for high valuations really doesn't do any good to you. Ask for something that implies selling anywhere from 15 to 25, maybe 30% of your business, and that's what it is. Next one, runway unrealistically short. This I also see where you would ask for too little money to realistically be able to hit the growth and product milestones that you need to hit in order to get ready to raise again. So as you're going from a seed to a Series A, for instance, you will be forced, or people will expect that you're able to demonstrate that you have hit product market fit, have identified what your sales and marketing playbook is, and just need more resources to double down on that playbook. And so if you don't ask for enough money, you may not be able to get there. And so be realistic about how much you need. Ultimately, as part of this, you also have to consider that on average, fundraising takes probably 5 to 6 months, and you have to account for that in your budgeting. So if you're raising 18 months, and then you need to be ready to raise again after 12, and 12 months can get tight already, depending on the business and the vertical that you're in. If you're an enterprise, in 12 months, how much progress can you realistically make? Be honest to yourself. Probably not a lot. And then last one, generic use of proceeds. There, ideally in your deck, you have two things. A roadmap where you talk about product and growth milestones that you will achieve in the next 18 months, roughly speaking. And then on your funding ask slide, you also tell me about, hey, here's the capital I'm raising. Here are the rough line items that I'm going to use that capital for: growth, product, legal, overhead, whatever it is. And then here are the specific outcomes I expect to achieve using that capital in the way I told you in the use of proceeds pie chart, for instance. And that will get me ready for the next round. So on the funding ask slide, I'm looking for a use of proceeds that has specific outcomes or activities tied to them that I believe will get you ready for your next round, because that's ultimately the only thing that I care as an investor, that other investors are buying into your business and follow on later on. All right, recognize that 18 minutes or 18 and a half minutes is a pretty long video, so I'll wrap it up here. Again, 4 categories of mistakes I find in almost all decks based on a ton of deck reviews. If you need help with your pitch deck, if you need help with fundraising strategy, reach out to me and my team at Zendog Labs. This is one area that we very much focus on based on our past experience and the client engagements that we had in the last 12 to 18 months. All right, have a great rest of your day and talk soon. Bye-bye.